What is karma? Karma is a very heavily connotated word that gets tossed around quite a bit in contexts that give it a bad rap, let's say. In my understanding, karma is like a lifelong teacher that never leaves our side and perpetually gives us opportunities to recognize the illusion of duality in our experience. The wheel of karma essentially represents the cycles of birth, life, and death. Or if it's a pattern in our life, it's the same cycle of arising, experiencing, and falling away. In the experiencing, we tend to get very attached. And the more attached we are to the experiencing, the more suffering, let's say, or the more painful the experience of the death of that karmic pattern leaving us will be. But truly, karma is just trying to create circumstances that tire us out, let's say, that tire us out from the whole experience of repetitive cycles in general. So karma wishes for us to become exhausted with the dual nature of reality, the doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, so that we at the very least become curious, or at most become absolutely desperate to get out of the cycle, to find another way to experience ourselves. That is, to find our own divinity, to find our natural state of being, which is beyond the delusion of life, death, and birth, of the karmic patterns. So I wrote out a little thought excerpt to explain karma more in depth, and also encourage you to try to view your own personal karmic patterns, to kind of use them as a gateway to recognizing the delusion of your experience. It's like a doorway into understanding the dual nature of reality, or it can be one of infinite doorways, let's say. And then I'll also use myself, my own karmic patterns, as an example. So let's get started. Understanding our karmic patterns is only a key for helping us to understand why we cannot escape the wheel of birth, life, and death. Why do we keep coming back to this experience? Why do we not directly experience our divine nature as God, or source, or universe, or consciousness? It is because the deep karmic grooves of our minds keep us fixated on relative reality, trapped in the world of duality, and perpetually frustrated that we cannot transcend this game, knowing and feeling all the while the field of consciousness which lies in infinity underneath our limited worldview and relative life story of experience. Or maybe it's better said, that which we are attached to. I put as a note here, there was a series I watched a while back on Netflix called The Midnight Gospel. And in episode 5 of this series, I think the episode was titled Annihilation of Joy, it kind of illustrates, and there's a lovely dialogue about the nature of this karmic wheel. And I think if you haven't seen that episode, it'd be highly beneficial to give you a visual if some of what I'm saying is a little too far out. And in watching it and then re-listening to this video, a lot of more things might click for you. All right, so I'll continue on here. I find that everyone has at least 3 big stories in their lives which keep them karmically and ancestrally stuck. Of those big 3 stories, there is both a light consciousness aspect of the karmic lesson and a negative shadow aspect of the lesson. So there's a polarity there. It fundamentally has to exist in the world of duality. So the pattern has to exist in a dual nature. Otherwise, we would see the game of it and the jig would be up. The three big stories play into and validate one another so as to keep the whole thing more real. So this is really important. I just tend to notice, or maybe I fixate on three of the big stories, like three big foundations. And you can think of them like tree trunks. And from those three big pillar tree trunks that are our personal karmic patterns, infinite branches come off that are smaller grooves or smaller patterns. And from those infinite branches come off of there. So essentially, even though there's three big stories, let's say patterns that we're really attached to, we're essentially still connected subtly to all of the infinite aspects of duality. And also we're still connected to the entire collective consciousness. So every single karmic pattern that could exist, every single aspect of duality that could exist, light, dark, hot, cold, man, woman, every single aspect, we are subject to all of that. And our consciousness is subject to all of that. So that just saying that we have three big patterns doesn't negate that infinite patterns exist. All right, so I'll continue on here. The stories are always rooted in foundational life circumstances. The families we are born into, our roles in those families, our gender perhaps, the national identity, the era of time, etc. So they're like always very fundamental things to our birth. They're always very relative to our birth. Even our astrological sign, you can say, they're always foundational. It appears that the seeds are planted, or rather watered again in this karmic life cycle, because likely the seeds have been planted many times over many lifetimes. The seeds are planted in early childhood traumas. I'll explain this further using myself and my ancestral patterns as an example. There is also a collective consciousness karma, of which I only mind the biggest three that I perceive. To me, the big three collective consciousness patterns are, number one, transcending the fear of death and birth. Number two, faith in our divine nature, which is that of God or infinite creation or supreme divinity. It is the faith, the knowingness, that we are creating all of duality. This whole experiential world is our own collective and unconscious painting. And the third karmic pattern is realizing love as the ultimate law of the universe or of consciousness itself. I'm not going to go into great detail about the collective consciousness patterns. I just wanted to kind of plant that seed, and you all can use your own imaginations to think about that or contemplate those three big karmic patterns. Again, there's a light consciousness aspect to each pattern, and there's a shadow dark aspect to each pattern. So you'll see that play out in different ways. So now I'm going to break down, give you guys a little insight into the dirt on Carrie. I'm going to break down my own three big karmic patterns so I can set an example for you to kind of go into contemplating your own karmic patterns. So the first karmic pattern I've noticed of mine is the fear of being imprisoned, confined, or powerless. And to me, this is tied to the fear of being alive in a body or the fear of death. It's kind of like both at the same time, more or less. I can remember being very young, maybe 4 or 5, having this recurring nightmare over and over and over again that I was in some kind of prison or some kind of situation where other people had captured me. And I was always hooked up to like a machine or put in some kind of trance or experiencing some kind of someone having control over me and me being powerless to my body, specifically my body or my mind being kind of like hijacked. So the seed was planted very early on. The light aspect of this karmic pattern is I am God. I am undying, unchanging. I am all powerful. So that's great. The shadow aspect of this lesson or pattern is the refusal to fulfill my dharmic duties in the world of duality and inhibiting my development and unfoldment. So more or less, I treat it like a teenage rebellion to being alive in a body, which is very counterintuitive because we wouldn't be here if there wasn't good reason. So the traumatic imprinting event that happened to me in my childhood that really set this pattern in stone and set it in motion was I was actually kidnapped by my father when I was 1 year old. So my father and my mother had separated, and my father was a drug addict, and in a desperate attempt to reunite the family, my father thought he might take me in the middle of the night as collateral to put my mother in a position where she had to be with him to get me back. Brilliant plan. So unfortunately, he drove 4 states north. I was gone for over a month. I'm not sure exactly how long. And my mother was unable to get the cops involved because they were still married at the time, even though they had been separated. And, there was no cell phones back then. It was in the 80s. So there was no way to know where he was or to get a hold of him. And no one in his family knew where he was. My father was dead silent for that. I think it was like 6 weeks that I was gone. Eventually, he called his mother from a payphone looking for money, and she said, return your daughter to me and I'll give you money. So he brought me back, and she drove me back down to Florida to my mother. So this is very, very traumatic. I don't have complete conscious awareness of this experience, but I do feel it in my body. And I know that I was in a car seat for long periods of time since there was such a big, travel in that experience, and that I was probably extremely traumatized. I don't know if I was still breastfeeding or not, but being away from your mother, at a young age is extremely traumatic. And I'm sure that she was very upset as well. And there's a very strong bond, if you've been a mother, between mother and child. So this really set the pace. I was powerless to this person who is delusional, and he held all the power, and I was very trapped in this situation. So, and that has played out in other scenarios, but that's where the seed was planted. The second karmic pattern that I notice as like one of those big tree branches in my life is the denial of emotional intelligence and defense in arrogance. And these patterns play off of one another and are tied to extreme delusion, more or less. The light aspect of this pattern is intelligence is nature itself. Intelligence is divinity itself. Wonderful. The light aspect is always very nice when you finally learn the lesson. It's great. The shadow aspect of this pattern is defense mechanisms, both are defense mechanisms, which keep me stuck in the illusion of division and the rejection of emotions. And emotions are very deeply tied to intuition, and your emotional guidance system is very important for self-understanding, let's say. So the ancestral trauma, the family pattern that I see attached to this part of the karmic pillar that I'm carrying on is I have a family line full of alcoholics, abuse, and kind of vacillating between religious and scientific dogmatism, which culminates in complete emotional disassociation nearly across the board, and worshiping of intellectualism while holding extreme judgment and defense. So, of course, all of this keeps the illusion of division between self and other very, very strong. And, the arrogance is essentially a protective mechanism. So this would play out in relationships, in partnerships, in business endeavors, jobs, careers. There's infinite applications. And this is one that I kind of find a lot with people who are very intelligent or who have some kind of abuse in childhood. So that's a pretty common one. The third karmic pattern that I notice in myself is, this is just a word I'm using to describe it because I'm not really sure what to, but I call it the mother-son conspiracy. And I'll go into a little more detail about it, but essentially the light aspect of this karmic pattern is love is the ultimate law of the universe, which is wonderful. The bond between mother and child is so strong. It's such a great way to experience love as true selflessness. The shadow aspect of this pattern is attachment, objectification, and coveting, which all fundamentally ignore the nature of change. So the family pattern trauma here, which you may be able to kind of disseminate from the first karmic pattern, is that as far as I know, or as far back as I can remember, it started with my grandmother and father. Could have started long before then, but I wouldn't know. My grandmother and father were in an enabling, dysfunctional, codependent relationship, and that pattern has been echoed in my mother and brother, and likely will continue to be echoed in me if I don't dissolve this pattern or detach from this pattern, usurping it in my own consciousness. So what happens here is essentially denial, inhibiting maturation on both ends, both mother and son, and extreme self-abuse and engulfment. This played out obviously for my father as a drug addict, but the self-abuse and engulfment can play out in a myriad of different ways. Essentially, there's such a strong attachment between mother and son that the son doesn't have enough space to develop his own identity outside of the mother. So there's an engulfment, and it's very inhibiting to maturing and stepping into adulthood. The dependency stays there basically for a lifetime. I mean, my grandmother and my father are still very, very codependent. So that is that pattern. That's all I'll say about that pattern. So when it comes to your own patterns, even just finding one big karmic pattern that's really embedded in your family or your ancestral trauma or early childhood trauma is great for kind of finding that key to open the door of breaking down the delusion of duality in general. But there's likely at least 3 big ones that are keeping you here in this lifetime that you might want to work through or become aware of at the very least. So I'm going to give you the last 3 kind of conclusive notes that I have about the practice of understanding karma and understanding your personal karma and how you can use it to dissolve the ego based on what I've discovered. Note number 1, the 3 big karmic imprints tend to keep us very convinced that our relative reality is the absolute reality. They are what keeps us reincarnating, essentially. If we are able to transcend them, we see the whole game for what it is and become non-attached while playing it and delighting in our dharmic roles here. And our dharmic roles tend to always fall in line with the evolution of consciousness, but must start with our own self-realization first. So that's how you kind of know if you're in a dharmic role, if you're trying to evolve or you're trying to make the world a better place, let's say, or make yourself a better person. Those are all following in your dharma, or even just following your joy is following in your dharma, but without attachment. Note number 2, the absolute truth is that none of the stories are real. We have deluded ourselves into taking them very seriously and developing characters based on this assumption. Totally unconsciously, mind you. We believe that we have a past, and we take our relative perspective of that past for granted. We cannot see actuality when we do this. Everything that we assume ourselves to be, everything that we remember about ourselves, is a complete and utter delusion. All of our life experience is a dream, an illusion. But we do not see it as such, and so here we are, playing out the karma over and over until we do. Last note, note number 3. We can begin to come to terms with this by breaking down the illusion, and this can be with anything. It can happen spontaneously. We cannot necessarily know what, when, or how this will come to be. We only need to hold the stronger and stronger desire in our hearts to know and experience the absolute truth. To keep an understanding that everything we perceive, everything, is total nonsense. To not take any of it too seriously while we keep playing the character. To recognize the space in between each breath. To recognize the space in between each heartbeat and to recognize the space in between each thought, between each etc., 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 between each anything, between the highs and the lows of experience. So this is the flat line, the middle ground. If we become curious about the middle ground and explore it without holding notions about it, we can transcend the game. And that's the most important part, because our ego has been very carefully conditioned and reinforced to constantly hold notions about everything and to attach and identify with the highs and the lows and anything that gives us more experience, more story, more character, more feeling, more. So this flat line, this middle ground, is a space of complete stillness. You can think of it like an EKG. In an EKG, when there's no heartbeat, it's flat. If there's a heartbeat, it goes up and down and up, and up and down and up. So this up and down and up, that's karma. High, low, high, high, low, high. But what we actually are, who we actually are, is in the flat line in between the beats, where there's, you could say, less excitement, or seemingly less excitement as far as the ego is concerned. So being curious and playfully exploring the flat line, playfully exploring between each breath, or playfully exploring between each thought, if you're able to gain enough concentration to do that, can be extremely helpful. My master used to drill into us, and in the teachings he gave to us, that curiosity and playfulness are the two most important things on the path of discovering who and what you really are. And I will echo that here now to you. Curiosity and playfulness helps a lot. Not taking yourself too seriously helps a lot. The ego really, really, really wants you to believe that all of this is real and that everything is intense and everything is so important. So whenever I have those experiences in life where I feel really, really excited or really, really defeated, immediately a light bulb goes off and I'm like, something's not quite right here. This is a trap. It almost always is. You know, if you're up, you're going to come down. You know, if you're down, you're going to go up. So I would say yes, being curious and playful, not taking it too seriously, are probably the most important things. And the desire to, maybe I should say the admitting truly and honestly to yourself that everything you think you know is total bullshit, is a big help. It's a big start. It really humbles you to experiencing the world like a 2-year-old. You know, if you pretend you've never learned anything, you don't know anything, you don't know what a phone is, you don't know what an apple is. If you just go into your entire experience like that, it makes transcending duality a lot less painful and easier, but it is very difficult. So meditation, of course, as I always recommend, is a great practice for gaining concentration and sinking down beneath the level of the intensity of thoughts and experiences and attachments. So I hope this video breaks down a little bit of what karma is and how you can use it to understand yourself more and understand the nature of duality more and become less attached to the whole thing, and inspires you to investigate your own big 3 karmic pillars that you are very attached to. If you guys have any questions or comments, please leave them for me. Like this video if you want more videos like this about karma or duality, and I will be more than happy to make them. Until next time.